The phone rang on a Tuesday evening, shrill, piercing vibration tearing apart the dead, sterile hush hanging over the West Wing corridor of St. Thomas Hospital. The hum of overhead fluorescent lights had wrapped around Lucas Grant like damp, mildewed wool for 16 straight sleepless hours, ever since he'd rushed through the glass double doors of the intensive care unit waiting room and collapsed onto a chipped, cold plastic bench bolted to pale gray linoleum flooring. Every muscle in his shoulders sagged forward with a bone-deep exhaustion that seeped into his bones, and he fumbled blindly inside the frayed canvas jacket slung over his frame, fingers shaking so violently the slim glass smartphone slipped twice from his clammy palms before he could clamp down tight and swipe the answer bar. Thin, ragged gasps fogged the hospital's overcooled recycled air. The entire corridor reeked of clinical antiseptic, faint stale coffee, and the quiet, unspoken grief that clung to every wall surface. Every few minutes, uniformed nurses and haggard junior doctors hurried past in quick, silent strides, rubber footwear squeaking against the floor, their faces locked behind a practiced, weary mask they'd honed over thousands of hours delivering terminal news to shattered families clinging to impossible hope long after medical statistics had flatlined. 10 minutes earlier, a senior hospital consultant wearing navy-embroidered scrubs had pulled Lucas into a tiny curtained side booth, voice stripped of all softness, and uttered one number that burned itself permanently into every crevice of his overtaxed, grief-fogged mind, £20,000 sterling. That was the full, non-negotiable upfront fee for emergency cranial microsurgery. The only procedure that stood even a fractional chance of halting the fatal internal bleeding from his father's ruptured cerebral aneurysm and pulling Thomas Grant back from irreversible brain death. Thomas Grant had collapsed without a single moment of warning at 7 o'clock that same morning, out on a muddy half-built residential construction plot tucked between rows of crumbling South London terraced houses. Overgrown front yards choked with discarded plastic waste, rusted garden fencing, and broken household debris. One heartbeat separated ordinary labor from catastrophic collapse. Thomas hauled heavy rusted steel rebar through thick rain-soaked building muck, broad, permanently calloused hands wrapped tight around cold metal, head thrown back as he laughed rough, loud alongside a small crew of teenage entry-level laborers, trading crude workplace jokes and loose plans for cheap weekend pub pints and local amateur football matches. The next instant, every ounce of strength drained from his frame, he crumpled forward face-first into the mud, one gnarled palm flying hard to the back of his skull, clear speech dissolving into wet, gurgling mumbles before his eyes rolled fully backward and consciousness vanished entirely. Panicked coworkers sprinted to his side within seconds, shouting for emergency ambulances, folding high-visibility orange work jackets to slide beneath his head and stem the thin trail of dark blood seeping from his temple, scrambling to shield his limp body from the bitter autumn wind until sirens wailed down the narrow residential street 10 minutes later. 2 tactical paramedics lifted him onto a rigid spinal board and rushed him straight through accident and emergency swing doors, where urgent sequential CT and MRI scans delivered a brutal, final diagnosis: a fully ruptured cerebral aneurysm, a condition certain to end in death without immediate, ultra-specialized private surgical intervention. The UK's National Health Service covered every preliminary stabilization measure, round-the-clock ICU vital sign monitoring, intravenous pain relief, full diagnostic imaging, and emergency fluid resuscitation, but the microscopic, delicate vessel repair work sat entirely outside the boundaries of standard public healthcare provision. Private surgical care was the sole viable lifeline, and private medical facilities demanded lump-sum cash Lucas simply could not scrape together. Not even a tiny fraction of the £20,000 total quoted by the hospital's specialist surgical team. At 24 years old, Lucas worked a dead-end junior analyst position within a faceless, mid-tier London consulting firm housed in a glass office tower on the fringes of the city financial district. His monthly salary was barely enough to stretch to extortionate Croydon studio rent, combined gas and electricity utility bills. Minimal basic grocery staples and the occasional discounted train ticket to cross the city and visit his father on the rare weekends Thomas's tight schedule allowed a break from dawn-to-dusk manual labor shifts. He maintained zero accumulated savings across any bank account. There were no valuable personal possessions he could liquidate quickly for emergency capital, no luxury wristwatches, designer outerwear, roadworthy second-hand cars with resale value, inherited antique jewelry or family heirlooms to pawn at short notice. Nor did Lucas have any wealthy, generous friends within his narrow social circle capable of advancing 5 figures in cash within the rigid 48-hour surgical cutoff window, the hard deadline after which swelling intracranial pressure would trigger permanent, untreatable brain damage. Lucas's mother had lost a long, agonizing battle against late-stage ovarian cancer when he was only 6 years old, leaving Thomas as his sole legal guardian. Lifelong quiet confidant and unshakable emotional anchor in a childhood defined by constant financial scarcity and unpredictable construction income. For nearly 2 full decades, father and son scraped by hand-to-mouth on erratic, weather-dependent building wages, willingly sacrificing every trivial small luxury imaginable to keep a leaky rented roof overhead and consistent hot food on their dinner table each evening. They never booked domestic or overseas holidays, avoided purchasing new clothing unless their existing garments fell to rags, never dined at sit-down restaurants unless a rare annual work bonus landed in Thomas's pocket, and rejected every unnecessary electronic device or household comfort to funnel all spare income straight into rent, food, Lucas's school supplies, and eventually university tuition fees. Across the entire tangled network of their shared blood relatives, only one man had amassed staggering, multi-million-pound wealth over the passing decades: Thomas's younger brother, Marcus Grant, founder and sole majority shareholder of Grant Construction Group, a regional building conglomerate turning tens of millions in annual revenue across London and all surrounding home counties' residential and commercial development projects. Lucas hovered his trembling thumb over Marcus's saved contact name glowing white on his mobile touchscreen for a full unbroken minute, throat swollen tight with suppressed, choking sobs, hot stinging tears pooling heavy at the inner corners of his eyes as his unfocused gaze locked onto the fogged double-glass partition separating the waiting room from the ICU ward, picturing his father's ashen, unresponsive face laid flat beneath starched hospital linens, dozens of thin plastic tubes snaking from every limb, chest rising and falling only via mechanical ventilator regulation. When he finally forced himself to tap the dial icon, the line rang 4 long, dragging cycles before Marcus deigned to lift the receiver, overwhelming ambient background noise swallowing Lucas's soft, hospital-muted voice entirely the second the call connected. Lucas could distinguish every layer of distant luxury celebration clear through the telephone static, crisp lead crystal wine glasses clinking against polished mahogany dining tabletops, soft mellow jazz instrumentals playing from hidden wall surround sound speakers, and loud, careless raucous laughter he recognized instantly as his cousin Julian's brash, unthinking cackle. The same mocking jeer that had haunted every childhood family gathering whenever Julian taunted them over hand-me-down clothing and cheap homemade packed lunchboxes. Uncle Marcus, Lucas rasped into the phone receiver, every single syllable cracking under the crushing weight of unspent terror and raw, unfiltered desperation. Dad's in intensive care at St. Thomas Hospital. The surgical team must complete the emergency cranial operation within 48 hours, or there is zero statistical chance he survives the aneurysm rupture. I need £20,000 transferred directly to the hospital's private patient payment account immediately. I will sign any formal, legally binding loan contract drafted by whichever solicitor you choose to retain, repay every single borrowed penny in full with monthly compound interest accrual. I swear I will never miss a single repayment installment, no matter how many decades the repayment timeline stretches out. A long, weighty, exaggerated sigh crackled thick with line static through the receiver, saturated with unmasked, undisguised irritation of a man whose trivial, self-indulgent evening leisure had been rudely interrupted by a nephew's life-or-death family crisis thousands of times less significant than his lavish dinner party entertainment. Lucas could paint the entire opulent scene vividly behind closed eyelids without a shred of doubt. Marcus slouching deep into custom Italian hand-stitched leather dining armchairs, swirling expensive vintage red Bordeaux within hand-blown crystal goblets. Utterly indifferent to Lucas's spiraling helplessness, trapped miles away in a cold, sterile hospital corridor littered crumpled patient leaflets and disposable paper medical cups. Lucas, lad, I truly wish I held uncommitted spare liquid capital sitting idle to step forward and assist your father. Believe me when I state that sincerely, Marcus drawled in a smooth, honeyed, rehearsed tone. The slow, polished cadence he'd refined over 30 years to schmooze high-net-worth private investors and elite London society clients at corporate galas and black-tie charity dinners. But your Aunt Clara and I exchanged binding legal property contracts for a premium Cornish coastal villa last month, hundreds of thousands of pounds sunk irrecoverably into non-refundable reservation deposits and ongoing full interior renovation schedules. On top of that major financial outlay, Clara has fixated obsessively on commissioning a top-spec, fully bespoke Range Rover Sport, its hand-tooled custom leather interior trim alone costing a small fortune by any household budget standard. Our corporate cash flow is stretched thinner than single-ply cheap tissue paper at present. I cannot extract £20,000 from our reserve coffers without completely tanking the quarterly liquidity buffer we rely on to secure all upcoming local council building tender bids across the capital. Uncle, please listen closely to what I am begging you. Lucas pressed his damp, fever-warm palm flat against the cold, painted cinder block hospital wall beside the bench, his free hand clenched so tight every knuckle blanched to an unnatural sickly white shade. £20,000 is an insignificant sum within your total personal and corporate asset pool. Your construction group clocks tens of millions in yearly turnover. You own multiple high-value investment townhouses spread across Chelsea, Kensington, and Hampstead. You dine at exclusive five-star West End private fine dining venues every single week without glancing at the final bill. This is no frivolous request for luxury travel or designer goods. It is the only barrier separating my father from premature death on an operating theater table before the week concludes. Nothing. Marcus's warm, performative, sympathetic lilt dropped sharply in a single heartbeat, every trace of manufactured concern evaporating entirely without warning, replaced by icy, patronizing condescension sharp enough to slice through tense air. You are far too young and woefully naive to stand there lecturing me on disposable personal and corporate revenue streams, Lucas. Your father actively chose his own lifelong path 55 years prior, laboring knee-deep in mud on construction sites alongside teenage rookies every working day, flatly rejecting senior office management and chartered surveying roles when I personally extended a formal grant construction position offered to him a full decade ago. That reckless, short-sighted life choice falls solely on his own shoulders, not a financial burden I am obligated to absorb for his poor judgment. Have you ever paused to consider this tragedy may simply be universal natural order? Every human being must reap the permanent, unavoidable consequences of their own long-term life decisions. The telephone line cut dead mid-breath without one additional word exchanged, a flat, hollow dial tone buzzing thin and empty in Lucas's ear as he froze rigid on the plastic bench. Blank, unfocused eyes fixed on his scuffed canvas trainers planted on gray linoleum flooring. Through faint residual static still clinging to the pressed receiver against his cheek, he caught fragmented echoes of Marcus's Kensington townhouse dinner party drifting across the miles, more crystal glassware clinking against polished wood, Julian's high-mocking laughter bouncing off vaulted plaster ceilings, a catering server popping the cork of another rare vintage wine bottle to pour for wealthy assembled socialites. Those distant, carefree sounds burrowed deep into Lucas's ribcage like hundreds of jagged broken glass shards, carving a raw, permanent bitter ache into his chest he knew would linger unhealed for every subsequent year of his life. He remained rooted motionless on that hard plastic corridor bench for nearly 4 uninterrupted consecutive hours, unblinkingly staring straight at the sealed ICU glass entrance, clinging to foolish, fragile hope that Marcus might soften his cold stance overnight, Might dial back Lucas's number with a bank wire transfer confirmation notification. Might finally acknowledge the decades of unbroken sacrifice Thomas had poured into feeding, clothing, and educating orphaned Marcus after their parents' premature passing left them both with zero other family support to rely upon. No incoming calls illuminated his mobile screen. No sympathetic text messages arrived offering even a tiny fraction of the £20,000 required sum to ease the mounting medical crisis weighing down Lucas's shoulders. Hospital wall-mounted digital clocks ticked away every endless dragging minute, each second stretching into agonizing eternity until the backlit nurse's station display flicked over to 3:47 a.m., the early pre-dawn hours of Wednesday morning. The 48-hour surgical deadline shrinking ever closer with every passing heartbeat. A middle-aged senior ICU nurse emerged silently through the heavy sliding glass ward doors at that exact timestamp, her hospital uniform crisp and perfectly starched, all soft facial features smoothed into a detached, unyielding professional calm. The emotional defensive shield every medical staff member hones over years working terminal care wards to buffer themselves and grieving relatives from the crushing weight of irreversible fatal news. She crossed the empty quiet corridor toward Lucas with slow, deliberate measured footsteps, lowering herself fully to one knee to match his downcast eye level, a latex-gloved clinical hand resting lightly, half-heartedly on his forearm in a hollow gesture of obligatory comfort carrying no genuine warmth beneath the sterile rubber barrier separating their skin. "Mr. Grant, I am deeply sorry to bear this devastating news to you," she said, her voice soft yet entirely unwavering, no trace of wavering emotion to cushion the blow of her statement. "Our full integrated surgical and critical care specialist team exhausted every single available intervention and experimental medical protocol within this hospital's resource capacity. Yet the tissue damage wrought by the ruptured aneurysm spread far too extensively across vital cerebral tissue to counteract effectively. We could not stabilize his dangerously elevated intracranial pressure for a sufficient window to secure a private surgical theater slot before irreversible brain death set in. Your father passed away peacefully 10 minutes prior to me stepping out to speak with you." Lucas did not break down into loud, racking sobs in that moment. A strange, all-encompassing numbing cold washed over his entire body in one crushing wave, seeping deep into every bone and muscle fiber, muting all human emotion to a faint distant hum until the entire surrounding world felt blurry, far removed and utterly surreal, as though he stood observing a horrific independent tragedy film projected behind thick fogged safety glass, with no ability to reach through the haze and alter a single frame of the unfolding disaster. Thomas Grant had died trapped outside operating theater access, never receiving a single follow-up telephone call from the younger brother he'd sacrificed his own teenage youth to raise through crippling orphaned poverty. Never hearing one solitary word of remorse or even token financial aid offer from Marcus to fund the life-saving cranial surgery he'd begged for hours before his father's heart stopped beating. The funeral service arrived 3 full days later, falling on a gray, relentlessly drizzly October morning, low heavy storm clouds suspended low overhead spilling thin. Miserable cold rained down over the cemetery's weathered stone headstones and overgrown unkempt grass plots dotted with faded plastic funeral bouquets, discarded by prior mourners. Lucas wore an ill-fitting second-hand black suit hastily borrowed from an old university flatmate, jacket sleeves cut far too short to cover his bony wrists, waistcoat hanging loose and baggy around his thin gaunt torso. Scratchy cheap polyester fabric chafing uncomfortably against his rain-chilled skin as he stood completely alone beside the freshly excavated open grave, separated by a wide stretch of damp waterlogged cemetery turf from Marcus, Clara and Julian's clustered family group. Every careless slight, every thoughtless, unfeeling gesture the trio displayed throughout the entire service Lucas filed away into a permanent, unerasable mental archive saturated with tangled grief and smoldering resentment settling heavy in his chest like waterlogged quarry stone. He watched Marcus circulate effortlessly among assembled mourners with effortless, rehearsed corporate networking charm, shaking every extended hand with firm, polished grips, murmuring generic interchangeable condolences to strangers and distant business associates alike, even pausing to pose stiff formal networking-style photographs beside wealthy property investors mid-burial despite laying his own elder brother to rest only minutes prior. He watched plump, entitled Julian clad head to toe in a luxury designer blazer and tailored wool chinos pull out his glossy smartphone directly mid-efficient eulogy, scrolling mindlessly through Instagram feeds and snickering at trivial viral memes while the minister spoke lengthily of Thomas's quiet lifelong kindness, relentless grit, and single-minded devotion to his only son. He watched Aunt Clara dab only the outer edges of her powdered eye sockets with a monogrammed Hermes silk handkerchief, not one single genuine tear streaking her heavily contoured cheek makeup. Her gaze drifting repeatedly away from the oak casket lowered into muddy soil to admire an oversized flashy diamond tennis bracelet wrapped tight around her wrist rather than paying basic respect to her husband's deceased elder brother laid out before her. Once all distant casual acquaintances, industry business partners, and local construction contacts cleared the cemetery grounds one by one, Marcus crossed the slippery rain-soaked stretch of grass to clap a heavy meaty palm firmly onto Lucas's slouched shoulder blade. His tailored wool overcoat carried sharp cloying luxury designer cologne blended with aged brandy fumes, a jarring stark contrast against Lucas's damp, threadbare borrowed suit saturated by hours of unbroken autumn rainfall. If there is anything our family can do to ease the weight of your grief in the months ahead, any favor, any amount of financial support, any tedious errand you cannot complete alone, voice your request without the slightest hesitation. No matter how large or small the scale of what you ask for, Marcus purred and honeyed, performative tones thick with manufactured generosity. Every word calibrated to put on a compassionate uncle performance for any lingering onlookers still within audible range. Lucas stared down at the hand on his shoulder, jaw tight with suppressed rage, replaying the desperate hospital call and Julian's mocking laughter frame by frame in his mind's eye. "There is exactly one single thing I need you to do for me," Lucas said, his voice flat, stripped entirely of tremor or sorrow, cold and hard as rain-soaked granite paving stone beneath their waterlogged leather footwear. "Name it, and it shall be yours without question or delay whatsoever. Remember every single tiny detail of this exact day for the rest of your entire natural life." Without waiting a split second for any reply or emotional reaction from Marcus, Lucas turned sharply on his heel and walked steadily away from the open grave, away from Marcus, Clara, and Julian. Away from every last trace of the ungrateful fractured blood family that had abandoned his father in his darkest mortal hour of need. He never glanced backward once as he advanced forward, heavy leather dress boots crunching loud against wet gravel and sodden fallen autumn leaves strewn across cemetery walkways as he vanished through towering wrought iron front gates straight into pouring rain, dissolving into gray mist hanging thick over surrounding residential terrace rooftops. 3 full uninterrupted weeks elapsed following the funeral before Lucas systematically erased every trace of his former London existence, without dramatic emotional goodbyes, no intentional bridge-burning gestures, no handwritten farewell notes left for consulting colleagues, Croydon neighbors, or casual city acquaintances he'd interacted with over years of urban residency. He simply ceased appearing at every location the world expected to find him, severing every thread binding him to the capital and all its intertwined painful memories. He submitted a formal typed resignation letter direct to the consulting firm HR department 2 days post-funeral, flatly declining an offered extended bereavement leave period without a single moment's consideration. He emailed his Croydon landlord to terminate the 12-month fixed rental lease months ahead of expiry, willingly forfeiting the full cash security deposit without negotiation. Packing every sparse personal possession into one scuffed 16-year-old canvas travel suitcase frayed along every seam and wheel casing. Tucked deep inside the jacket's inner lining, pressed constant against his chest at all times, rested the crumpled yellowed St. Thomas Hospital private patient payment slip. Thin printer paper worn frayed thin after hundreds of repeated unfoldings and refoldings across those hellish 48 hours waiting fruitlessly for the emergency surgical funding Marcus had refused to provide. A rough, unpolished long-term life blueprint solidified within Lucas's mind over those sleepless morning weeks, forged entirely from unprocessed grief and slow-simmering, unextinguished resentment. The plan lacked polished investor pitch profit projections, color-coded milestone timelines, or formal market expansion roadmaps. Yet it held an unshakable core purpose that propelled him forward each dawn when crippling despair threatened to swallow him whole and trap him in endless cycles of self-blame and crippling regret. Thomas Grant had spent every single waking adult hour laboring with rough, permanently calloused palms split open by construction splinters and heavy tool abrasions, bouncing between residential carpentry, seasonal garden landscaping, and endless building site manual work to scrape weekly wages sufficient to feed Lucas and cover monthly rental costs. Lucas's mother's drawn-out terminal illness and subsequent death stripped every soft comfort from Thomas's daily routine, leaving his young son as his sole lasting joy amid decades of financial struggle. Yet the elder Grant harbored one quiet, all-consuming passion entirely separate from endless survival labor: single malt Scotch whiskey. It was not mindless, reckless drinking that captivated him, but the intricate, layered artistic craft and rigorous hard science of distillation. Multi-year oak cask maturation and precise flavor balancing, transforming humble barley and mineral spring water into transcendent amber liquid through years of unhurried waiting, locked inside sealed wooden barrels untouched by rushed mass-production commercial schedules. Every single Sunday afternoon, once the week's grueling physical labor concluded, Thomas dragged a chipped, scarred wooden kitchen table to the window of their cramped, rented terraced house, retrieved a dog-eared, thick, leather-bound tasting notebook from the highest, dusty kitchen shelf lined with chipped ceramic mugs and tinned bean containers, and sampled minuscule malt vials scraped together from negligible disposable weekly income, never allowing himself more than one small sip per sample to avoid wasting the rare, precious spirit. He jotted granular, hyper-detailed handwritten notes cataloging every sensory detail captured by his sharp, practiced palate: peat smoke kiln intensity, oak cask tannin leaching levels, secondary dried fruit and wild heather honey flavor layers, subtle mineral undertones unique to each distillery's underground spring water aquifer source. He repeated his core distilling philosophy countless times over cheap Sunday vegetable stew dinners, swirling pale golden malt beneath dim kitchen lamplight in quiet, reverent murmurings spoken solely to his son seated across the table from him. Any amateur with basic copper still equipment and a batch of barley mash can distill crude spirits, boy, Thomas would say, weathered rough fingertips brushing lined, annotated notebook pages filled with decades of accumulated tasting observations. But crafting a single malt that lingers vividly in human memory long after the glass empties, one carrying tangible emotional weight, deep layered complexity, and a fully lived personal story woven into every individual sip, that demands unhurried, unbroken patience stretching across multiple years upon years of silent waiting while time works its quiet alchemy deep within sealed oak maturation casks locked away in dark warehouse vaults. Hasty, rushed manufacturing only generates cheap, instantly forgettable swill no consumer remembers 24 hours after drinking it. Slow, deliberate craft builds lasting intergenerational legacy that outlives the hands that first distilled it. Lucas safeguarded every leather-bound tasting notebook with obsessive care, packing them securely at the absolute bottom of his battered canvas suitcase alongside faded, creased-framed parental wedding photographs. A tiny hand-carved wooden plane Thomas had constructed for his childhood weekend woodworking lessons, and that crumpled hospital payment slip permanently stowed within jacket lining pressed against his heart wherever he traveled. Those well-worn notebooks contained far more than simple flavor-tasting logs and distilling technical notes. They housed Thomas's unfulfilled lifelong teenage dream: purchasing an abandoned Highland stone distillery to craft proprietary small-batch single malt built entirely by his own hands without answering to profit-hungry corporate investors dictating rushed production quotas. Lucas's entire self-forged life plan revolved around breathing tangible living life back into that long-abandoned, unfulfilled dream, twisting the distillery brand's creation into slow, methodical, unrushed reckoning for Marcus's cold-hearted cruelty and ungrateful betrayal 10 years prior. The fateful Tuesday night he'd callously refused £20,000 to save his own elder brother's life. Edinburgh's brutal northern Scottish winter descended upon Lucas within days of his arrival in the capital, relentless damp cold seeping through every layered garment he owned, thick opaque white fog clinging to dawn cobblestone streets lined with shuttered shop fronts, bitter unceasing wind whipping off the wide firth of Forth Estuary slicing straight through thin winter coats and cheap knit scarves alike, leaving exposed cheeks and knuckles raw and stinging for hours after stepping outdoors. Within 48 hours of checking into a cramped budget city hostel for his first 2 nights of residency, Lucas secured a minimum wage warehouse attendant role at a small independent outlying Edinburgh distillery. Earning a mere £1,200 per calendar month, barely adequate to cover basic food staples, essential toiletries, and minimal portable electric heating for the makeshift on-site living quarters, he negotiated reluctant manager permission to occupy. He convinced a gruff, no-nonsense, middle-aged Highland warehouse supervisor with a permanent gruff scowl and zero tolerance for idle workplace chatter to allow him to drag a thin, frayed military surplus canvas cot into a forgotten, shadowed storage nook sandwiched between towering, stacked 50-gallon oak maturation casks reaching nearly the warehouse's vaulted stone ceiling height, converting the unused cranny into permanent living quarters where he ate all meals, slept nightly, and buried himself in distilling textbooks long past every evening shift's official clock-out time. All daylight working hours passed hauling heavy solid oak barrels across cold slippery stone warehouse flooring, stacking empty drained casks into stable towering piles for deep cleaning and reconditioning, organizing endless rows of handwritten malt production batch inventory ledgers, mopping sticky spilled malt mash residue from concrete walkways, and executing every menial backbreaking labor duty no other full-time warehouse employee volunteered to complete without complaint. The exact second his daily shift clocked out via the warehouse punch card machine each evening, Lucas lit a cheap dim battery-powered desk lamp balanced atop a splintered wooden shipping crate beside his army cot and buried himself for hours in dog-eared second-hand distilling textbooks sourced from online vintage book dealers, dense peer-reviewed academic yeast fermentation research papers, complex oak cask maturation chemistry studies, and traditional peat malt kiln processing technique. Manuals covering every regional Scottish whiskey production style, from Islay to Speyside to the Northern Highlands. He memorized every granular technical distilling specification, subtle regional malt flavor profile distinction, and strict official Scottish single malt regulatory statute until his eyes burned raw and heavy with unrelenting midnight exhaustion, refusing to pause study even after 12 straight hours of barrel-hauling physical labor earlier that day. Fellow warehouse co-workers whispered mocking commentary behind his back whenever they believed Lucas could not overhear their hushed conversations, confused and faintly derisive of his bizarre self-sacrificing life choices. A sharp university-educated young man abandoning stable London white-collar office salary and warm city apartment to haul heavy wooden barrels for minimum wage in an uninsulated, freezing Highland warehouse, wasting every post-work evening buried in dense technical textbooks. Long after every other staff member departed the distillery grounds for village pub lager pints and battered fish and chip takeaway meals, Lucas ignored every scrap of casual workplace judgment and quiet ridicule entirely, their snide whispered remarks sliding clean off him like cold rain sliding off waxed waterproof outerwear, never diverting his laser-sharp dual-core focus. Mastering every single facet of professional malt whiskey production from raw barley malting to finished bottling, and accumulating sufficient wealth and industry prestige to deliver quiet permanent reckoning to Marcus Grant for abandoning Thomas to die alone inside St. Thomas Hospital's ICU waiting corridor a decade prior. He taped that crumpled, yellowed hospital private patient payment slip completely flat to the rough exposed brick wall positioned directly above his army cot sleeping space, secured with faded aged packing tape so it stood as the very first object his eyes registered every single dawn upon waking, a permanent, unflinching, tangible reminder of Marcus's unrepayable lifelong gratitude debt owed to Thomas. The crushing humiliation and helpless powerlessness Lucas endured trapped in that sterile London hospital corridor the night his father's life slipped away forever due to a lack of £20,000 in emergency surgical funding. That small slip of printer paper evolved into his unwavering internal moral compass and endless emotional fuel reservoir, the driving catalyst behind every late-night textbook study marathon, every physically agonizing 10-hour warehouse labor shift, every tiny personal sacrifice endured to steadily climb the competitive international spirits industry ranks grueling step by grueling step across the years ahead. 2 full unbroken calendar years of relentless, monotonous manual warehouse labor and rigorous, self-directed distilling academic education elapsed before the distillery's veteran master blender finally recognized Lucas's extraordinary, innately precise sensory palate, offering him a formal promotion to junior assistant blender, transferring him permanently out of cold, damp barrel storage vaults into climate-controlled, sealed tasting laboratories lined wall-to-wall with thousands of sample malt vials spanning every Highland, Speyside, and Islay distillery regional style. Within those temperature-regulated quiet lab rooms, under direct one-on-one tutelage from the distillery's decades-tenured master distiller, Lucas learned the delicate, infinitely nuanced artistic craft of blending distinct aged malt distillates together to craft marketable balanced consumer flavor profiles, absorbing every subtle blending trick and palate calibration exercise passed down through generations of Scottish whiskey artisans. He volunteered for every optional after-hours tasting shift without hesitation, took unopened sealed laboratory sample vials home for private late-night flavor decomposition analysis, steadily refining his innate ability to detect the faintest trace concentrations of peat smoke, vanilla oak sweetness, wild dried berry fruit, coastal sea salt, and mineral spring water within even the subtlest, most delicately balanced premium malt whiskey expressions crafted by small independent Highland distilleries scattered across the Scottish mainland and island regions. For full calendar years after Lucas first fled London to resettle in Edinburgh, aged exactly 28 years old, he earned a landmark industry-wide celebrated professional milestone title, the youngest ever appointed head blender of any fully independent family-owned Scottish distillery operating within all officially designated malt whiskey geographical production zones of Scotland. His full name appeared repeatedly across national and international spirits trade publications as a rapidly rising young artistic prodigy gifted with an unparalleled hypersensitive sensory palate paired with deep lifelong reverence for traditional, historic distilling craft seamlessly balanced alongside bold, innovative modern blending techniques that resonated powerfully with younger cross-continental consumer markets across Asia, North America, and mainland Europe. Leading global whiskey trade critics universally praised Lucas's singular creative talent to faithfully honor classic historic Highland malt flavor foundations, while weaving subtle, unexpected layered flavor twists into each bottling that struck immediate emotional resonance with young new drinkers unfamiliar with traditional single malt culture, earning the small rural Edinburgh distillery its first prestigious regional gold medal award at the annual Scottish National Malt Whisky Competition. Under Lucas's full creative blending and product development creative leadership within 18 months of assuming the head blender role. 6 full calendar years after Lucas abandoned London and erased every trace of his old urban life, he carried a thick leather-bound hardcover printed business plan filled with high-resolution distillery architectural restoration renderings, comprehensive multi-page market research data spreadsheets, and multi-year compound financial growth projection models into towering glass skyscraper venture capital offices nestled deep within the City of London's central financial district, fully prepared to deliver a formal investor pitch outlining his complete long-term vision for an independent global luxury spirits enterprise built entirely around the flagship malt brand he had christened Ashes of Eden. The sunlit floor-to-ceiling glass-walled conference room hosting his investor presentation seated 5 senior investment professionals across a polished, solid walnut boardroom table. For middle-aged male venture capitalists bearing blank, impassive facial expressions, their gazes rigidly fixed on printed financial spreadsheets and wall-projected 5-year profit forecast graphs without displaying any genuine curiosity toward Lucas's deeply personal brand origin narrative or distillery. Restoration Creative Vision, alongside one 40-something sharp-minded female founding managing partner named Eleanor Sharp, lead principal of Sharp Capital. Her dark natural hair cut into a precise, sleek, sharp bob framing angular defined jawline, pale gray eyes incisive and piercing as a veteran surgeon's precision scalpel. Absorbing every single word Lucas uttered with unbroken laser-intense full concentration while the four male investors remained detached, distracted, and largely indifferent to the emotional core anchoring his entrepreneurial project. Our formal registered corporate entity will operate under the legal business title Grant Spirits Limited, Lucas explained clearly. Standing upright beside a wide wall-mounted projection screen displaying high-definition architectural renderings of his proposed abandoned Highland Stonewater Mill Distillery restoration facility, his voice steady and assured despite the immense weight of decades-long personal ambition resting squarely upon his shoulders, our flagship debut core single malt product bottling line will bear the official brand name Ashes of Eden, the central narrative anchor for all global product lines and cross-continental brand storytelling marketing initiatives across every international export territory we intend to penetrate. Eleanor leaned forward slightly within her padded premium leather executive office chair, breaking the uniform heavy stony silence that had settled over the conference room throughout every preceding entrepreneur's investor pitch presentation held that same morning. Her thin stainless steel fountain pen paused mid-note above lined legal notepad paper resting flat atop the polished walnut table surface directly in front of her, all casual investor indifference vanishing instantly from her sharp professional bearing as she directed her full undivided attention solely toward Lucas and his layered brand origin backstory. Walk us through the layered conceptual narrative behind the brand moniker Ashes of Eden, she requested, her tone crisp, direct, and entirely stripped of trivial small talk. A defining hallmark of her ruthless, purely results-driven investment style, forged over 15 years funding luxury beverage startups. Eden evokes unspoiled, perfect paradise, the untarnished ideal every human being craves, Lucas elaborated, gesturing to the site renderings on the projection screen, while ash stands for ruin, loss, and the slow decay born of suffering. The most complex malts are forged in controlled peat fire and charred oak, matured amid derelict stone mills. Human resilience rises the same way, out of life's broken ashes. Eleanor held his gaze for 5 long seconds, searching for performative sentiment and finding only raw, lived grief before nodding her approval. "Leave all your documentation with my assistant," she instructed. "I will send a definitive funding offer by 8 a.m. tomorrow." Promptly at 8 the next morning, Eleanor's private line called, laying out uncomplicated terms: £5 million seed capital for a permanent 15% equity share in Grant Spirits, with one non-negotiable condition attached to the full release of funds. Before signing any investment contract, she required an in-person full inspection of the Highland land Lucas planned to restore into a distillery. No pre-recorded virtual tours or third-party engineering reports would suffice for her due diligence. Lucas agreed instantly, renting a 4-wheel drive and driving Eleanor 300 miles north into remote Speyside. The plot sat on overgrown moorland centered on a derelict 1920s stone water mill with a collapsed slate roof, ivy-choked granite walls, and a crystal mineral spring brook running beside its foundations, Thomas's birthplace in 1966. Lucas told Eleanor how his father left the valley at 16 to labor in London, carrying an unspoken distillery dream the whole time. Eleanor, who had only ever heard founders talk revenue multiples, recognized the weight of unresolved regret and wrote the full investment check before their return drive to Edinburgh. 18 months of grueling construction restored the mill's granite walls, installed custom copper stills, and carved a hillside maturation warehouse overlooking the mineral spring brook. For further years of global trade shows, export negotiations, and international award ceremonies saw Ashes of Eden explode as Britain's defining premium malt brand. Core bottlings won cross-continental gold medals, limited vintage releases sold at auction for 10 times retail price, stocked in Michelin restaurants, Manhattan penthouse bars, and elite private cellars across Dubai, Geneva, and Los Angeles. Under parent firm Grant Spirits, Lucas acquired 3 Heritage Highland and Islay distilleries, took a 60% stake in a French cognac estate, and built Asian distribution hubs in Tokyo, Shanghai, Seoul, and Singapore. Financial Times named him Entrepreneur of the Year. Financial analysts valued his personal wealth at over £800 million. Lucas uniformly declined all media interviews, refusing to discuss his father's death or fractured blood relations. Only Eleanor knew the decade of quiet vengeance fueling every corporate expansion move he orchestrated. One misty autumn night, the pair stood on Grant Spirits' London rooftop terrace, sipping Uniged new-make malt overlooking the Thames skyline. Lucas laid bare every painful memory of the hospital call, Marcus's fabricated excuse, Julian's dinner party mockery, and the hollow funeral performance, alongside the graveside vow he had sworn 10 years prior. Eleanor realized the vast multinational enterprise Lucas built existed solely to dismantle Marcus's construction conglomerate, not accumulate wealth or public prestige. Lucas clarified he never sought physical harm or asset seizure, only one unreserved, sincere verbal apology for refusing £20,000 and letting Thomas die unattended. Eleanor warned him against transforming into the greedy, ungrateful man he loathed within his own uncle, a caution Lucas acknowledged with a thin, weary smile before she departed for her private town car. At that exact time, Marcus's Grant construction had hemorrhaged capital across 2 full fiscal years, teetering on irreversible bankruptcy, crippled by lost council tenders, severed business partnerships, restricted bank lending, and dozens of unpaid subcontractor lawsuits. Every crisis could be traced back to anonymous shadow subsidiaries covertly funded by Grant Spirits, paired with carefully planted industry rumors that eroded Marcus's professional credibility beyond repair. Eleanor witnessed every ruthless strategic move Lucas authorized, holding quiet ethical reservations yet never intervening, privately believing Marcus had earned the slow, inevitable ruin closing in around him. A bleak rainy December afternoon, Lucas's front desk reception informed him Marcus waited uninvited in the marble lobby, requesting an urgent private audience. Lucas ordered staff to escort Marcus directly to his 35th floor glass executive suite overlooking rain-blurred London. Marcus appeared gaunt and defeated, coat frayed and stained, hair graying prematurely, eyes heavy with exhaustion. He begged Lucas for an immediate £2 million emergency loan to cover payroll, supplier debts, and delayed residential construction contracts, promising full repayment within 12 months at standard commercial interest rates. Lucas slid the framed hospital payment slip across the walnut desk and laid out irrefutable proof. Catering receipts confirmed Marcus hosted a lavish multi-thousand-pound dinner that same Tuesday night 10 years prior, Julian showing off custom Ferrari wheels, Marcus gifting £2,000 vintage wine to wealthy guests. One evening's entertainment would have fully covered Thomas's life-saving surgery twice over. Marcus broke down sobbing, pleading mercy for shared blood ties. Lucas explained sustained hatred drained his emotional energy, and Grant Spirits maintained an official policy against funding insolvent businesses with no viable long-term recovery plan. Marcus erupted in anger, claiming Thomas would be horrified by his coldness, and Lucas snapped that Marcus had forfeited all right to speak his father's name the night he chose to let him die to escape decades of gratitude debt. He recounted every teenage sacrifice Thomas had endured to feed, clothe, and school orphaned Marcus after their parents passed away young. Marcus collapsed against the rain-fogged glass wall, admitting he had held £3 million in incoming construction payments that afternoon and had secretly hoped Thomas's death would erase his lifelong obligation of thanks. Lucas flatly refused the loan and instructed Marcus to leave the premises. Once the oak door latched shut, Lucas was overcome by the same hollow, bone-deep exhaustion he had felt in the ICU waiting room the night his father died. The long-awaited confrontation brought no catharsis, only empty weariness. Eleanor emerged from a hidden one-way observation room, having watched the entire exchange through mirrored glass, and stated she had anticipated his refusal all along. A full calendar month after the executive suite confrontation, Ashes of Eden hosted its annual International Spirits Tasting Gala on the Speyside Distillery grounds, welcoming hundreds of overseas distributors, elite beverage critics, and high-net-worth malt collectors flown in from 37 export nations. Midway through the guided production facility tour, Lucas's personal assistant pulled him into a quiet stone-side corridor to relay that Julian Grant waited uninvited within the floor-to-ceiling glass panoramic sunroom overlooking mist-shrouded Highland moorland, claiming time-sensitive private family business requiring one-on-one discussion without gala attendees present. Lucas stepped into the sunroom to find Julian dressed in cheap clearance formal wear, frame bloated from years of unregulated gambling and idle unemployment. No steady professional background to his name. Julian immediately launched into a drawn-out self-pitying monologue detailing the collapse of Grant Construction, his mother Clara's stress-induced cardiac medical bills, and their eviction from the Kensington townhouse, before demanding a fixed £120,000 annual brand ambassador salary, arguing their blood relation made formal distilling certification, foreign language fluency, and verified work history irrelevant prerequisites. Lucas poured 2 identical crystal tumblers of the distillery's 12-year core single malt, placing one before Julian and posing 3 unyielding professional questions in sequence. First, full technical knowledge of malt production cycles from peat kills to final blending ratios. Second, foreign language proficiency for global tasting masterclasses. Third, length of consistent full-time employment across the past decade. Julian could provide no substantial, qualified answers to any of the 3 inquiries. Lucas explained 60% of the brand's yearly revenue stemmed from cross-border overseas markets, every official ambassador multilingual and professionally certified, while Julian carried the tarnished surname linked to Marcus's bankrupt firm with 0 marketable expertise to offer the enterprise. Lucas then repeated the memory of Julian's mocking laughter over the telephone 10 years prior, when Julian had joked that working-class patients wasted hospital resources and oxygen while Thomas lay dying in ICU. All color drained from Julian's face, unable to formulate any credible denial. Lucas issued a permanent lifetime ban barring Julian from all distillery premises, summoning 2 uniformed security guards to gently but firmly escort him out through the iron main gates. Once Julian's tearful footsteps faded beyond the stone walls, Lucas lifted his own malt glass and took a small sip, only to find every warm layered flavor overshadowed by an acrid, bitter aftertaste of reawakened old grief. He set the tumbler down unfinished, gazing out over endless foggy moorland and wondering whether the cycle of entitled pleas from Marcus's family would ever truly end. That harsh wind-scoured Highland winter saw a tiny, overlooked bankruptcy notice for Grant Construction printed on the back financial pages of the Times, paired with a grainy photograph of Marcus slumping out of London's High Court Civil Division building beneath cold winter rain. Lucas glanced at the headline briefly over his morning coffee before flipping the newspaper to sports, uninterested in the fine details of asset auctions and mass employee redundancies. Eleanor sat across the oak breakfast table in Lucas's Distillery cottage annex, peeling a ripe orange and asking whether victory carried any sweet satisfaction after 10 years of calculated corporate pressure. Lucas replied there existed no triumph to savor, only hollow relief, having sealed every potential escape route Marcus might have accessed long before the formal court liquidation ruling was published. That same afternoon, Lucas drove 300 miles south to Highgate Cemetery, visiting Thomas's simple gray granite headstone etched "He taught us patience." He knelt on damp grass beside the grave and laid 3 offerings neatly upon the turf: the framed hospital billing slip, a printed copy of the newspaper bankruptcy notice, and an unopened full bottle of Ashes of Eden 12-year single malt wrapped in thin tissue paper. He unscrewed the oak bottle stopper and poured amber malt liquid across the dark cemetery soil, speaking softly to his father's resting place of the distillery he had built to fulfill Thomas's teenage dream, and the 10 years he had spent dismantling Marcus's business to settle an old, unpaid debt of gratitude. He admitted he had failed to fully live by his father's lessons of mercy and patience, yet swore from that day forward he would release the decade of unbroken rage weighing upon his heart, even if immediate forgiveness remained out of reach. A sharp winter gust swirled dead oak leaves around his kneeling form. He brushed mud from his trousers, stood upright, and turned his back on the headstone without a single backward glance, walking along winding gravel paths toward the cemetery iron gates and leaving the 3 offerings undisturbed beside the grave. The following spring brought a major public corporate announcement from Grant Spirit's communications team, circulated simultaneously across global spirits trade publications and mainstream national news outlets. The establishment of the Thomas Grant Medical Relief Foundation, permanently endowed with a £20 million untouchable charitable trust fund, with all emergency zero interest, collateral-free loans rigidly capped at exactly £20,000 for working-class families facing unaffordable private brain aneurysm cranial surgery fees, the exact sum Lucas had begged Marcus to transfer 10 years prior. At the Foundation's Grand Edinburgh Georgian Townhouse launch press conference, a young financial journalist asked Lucas why he had fixed the loan limit to that precise figure rather than a larger rounded amount. Lucas stood center stage without script or teleprompter, his voice quiet and sincere as he recounted his father's preventable death waiting for that critical lump sum, explaining the foundation existed as his personal atonement for 10 years consumed by vengeful bitterness, designed to spare other ordinary families the same crushing helplessness he had endured within St. Thomas' ICU waiting room. Video footage of the speech accumulated more than 5 million unique online views within 24 hours flat, splitting public opinion sharply between supporters praising authentic charity and critics dismissing the initiative as a calculated tax optimization public relations stunt. Lucas never read social media commentary or requested staff summaries of online discourse. Each evening at dusk, he walked from the Distillery production halls to the Foundation's office building, standing outside floor-to-ceiling front windows to watch desperate parents, partners, and adult children submit emergency surgery loan applications, silently recognizing the identical fear and powerlessness he knew all too intimately from his own past trauma. Eleanor detected a profound, unmissable shift in Lucas's overall temperament one mild spring evening atop the Distillery's hillside rooftop viewing terrace, overlooking rolling Speyside moorland beneath soft sunset hues of pink and gold bleeding across distant Cairngorm mountain peaks. She leaned against weathered copper safety railings and commented he had shed the cold, single-minded revenge mindset that had defined every business decision for a full decade, finally human again. Lucas offered his first genuine, unguarded smile in 6 years of their acquaintance, recounting a solo weekend road trip he had taken down to Cornwall to inspect the coastal villa Marcus had fabricated as an excuse to refuse the emergency surgery loan 10 years prior. The cottage turned out small, leaky, crumbling at roof and window frames, a complete work of fiction Marcus had invented to evade his lifelong debt of thanks. Lucas admitted he had wasted a full decade hating a manufactured lie with no basis in reality. Eleanor reminded him the past could never be rewritten or erased, and the only available choice was to build goodness forward out of all accumulated loss and suffering. Another cold, damp winter rolled around fast, delivering a shaky handwritten letter sent from a worn London suburban envelope bearing Julian's uneven cursive handwriting. The note contained devastating medical news. Marcus had received a terminal pancreatic cancer diagnosis, hospital specialists giving him no more than 3 months remaining life. Julian begged Lucas to grant one final private hospital audience so Marcus could deliver a full verbal apology he had spent months drafting in preparation. Lucas read the letter 3 separate times yet sent no reply, no text or phone call to his cousin. Even so, 3 days after the correspondence arrived at the Distillery post room, Lucas packed a small overnight bag, rented a powerful 4-wheel drive vehicle and drove 6 continuous hours south to London's Royal Marsden Cancer Hospital without advance warning to either Julian or Marcus. When he stepped into the private oncology ward, Marcus lay skeletal beneath thin linen sheets sustained by nutrient-feeding tubes and a portable oxygen ventilator humming beside the adjustable hospital bed. Once faint recognition flickered behind Marcus's medication-fogged eyes, the dying man confessed every concealed truth he had hidden for 10 years, He had held £3 million in confirmed incoming construction payments that exact Tuesday afternoon, and had secretly hoped Thomas's aneurysm would prove fatal to erase the decades-long gratitude debt he owed his elder brother. Lucas recounted gentle childhood memories of teenage Thomas sheltering terrified young Marcus through thunderstorms, explaining he would not orchestrate any further financial ruin against whatever small fragments of Marcus's family remained intact. Not out of mercy for his uncle, but out of deep abiding respect for the compassionate worldview his father had spent his whole life embodying. As Marcus whispered a hoarse, broken word of thanks through his oxygen mask, Lucas rose to leave the ward. Julian leaned exhausted against the cold linoleum wall outside the glass ward door, eyes swollen red from weeks of round-the-clock vigil duty beside his terminally ill father. Lucas paused only long enough to deliver one quiet instruction to his cousin before continuing down the empty, sterile hospital corridor. Stay by Marcus's side through every remaining month of his life. Care for him as Marcus had refused to care for Thomas all those years ago. The next mild spring brought formal notification of Marcus's quiet passing within Royal Marsden's private ward. His pancreatic cancer had progressed faster than medical teams initially predicted. His last will contained no instructions for church funerals or cemetery burials, directing solicitors to arrange full cremation with ashes scattered unceremoniously along central London's River Thames. No friends, business associates, or distant kin required to attend any memorial gathering whatsoever. Lucas entirely skipped the small, somber ash-scattering service Julian held alone beside the river, instead hosting a grand limited edition return malt collection launch event at the Speyside Ashes of Eden Distillery to debut the brand's newest vintage bottling series. Every glass bottle's printed label featured high-resolution scanned reproductions of Thomas's aged handwritten malt tasting notes copied directly from the leather notebooks Lucas had carried north from London 10 years prior. Printed beneath a single quiet line of text, "A great malt, much like a person, matters not where it begins, but the time it endures." Once all journalists, overseas collectors, and international distributors departed the distillery grounds following the day's press event, Eleanor handed Lucas a plain brown courier envelope delivered earlier that morning by a downcast, exhausted Julian. Inside rested a faded 1978 Polaroid photograph capturing teenage Thomas and Marcus kneeling side by side beside the Speyside Spring Brook, bare feet submerged in cold running water, both grinning wide with missing juvenile teeth. Tucked beneath the Polaroid was a crumpled scrap of cheap notebook paper bearing Julian's rushed handwriting. He whispered your father's name as he drew his last breath. Lucas flipped the Polaroid over to read faint faded pencil scribbling on the reverse side. Thomas's teenage handwriting, "My brother, my only family." He slid the photograph and scrap of paper deep inside the bottom drawer of his solid oak distillery office desk, stowing them alongside the framed yellowed hospital billing slip he had carried everywhere for a decade. Then closed the drawer firmly and latched the small brass lock with a quiet click. Outside the office's tall floor-to-ceiling windows, Highland spring bloomed in full splendor. Melting snow from distant Cairngorm peaks fed the crystal-clear spring water intake winding past the restored stone mill granite walls. Wild white heather and bright yellow gorse wildflowers carpeted every sloped stretch of hillside grassland surrounding the distillery buildings, and soft breezes drifting through open window panes carried the sharp, earthy scent of damp spring soil and fresh sprouting barley from the distillery's small on-site malting plots at the valley edge. Eleanor stepped forward to press a heavy-lead crystal tumbler filled with golden ashes of Eden's single malt into Lucas's outstretched palm, her own matching glass balanced loosely in her opposite hand, and asked what thoughts occupied his mind in that quiet moment beneath the warm golden sunset spilling over rolling moorland ridges. Lucas's gaze lingered on the polished, hand-hammered copper distillation, stills glowing soft bronze within the distillery's production hall visible through the office's side glass partition. His voice calm and entirely unburdened by the decade of bitter resentment that had once consumed every waking thought and business choice. He spoke of his father's old lesson that malt always retains the memory of its origins, every barley grain, every drop of spring water, every year locked within charred oak casks, and admitted he had finally reconnected with his own roots. No longer defined solely by grief and a 10-year quest for retribution, but by the gentle, redemptive path stretching forward from all he had endured and built. Eleanor tapped the base of her crystal glass gently against Lucas's own in a silent, wordless toast, the soft, clear clink echoing through the empty, sun-warmed office space. "To memory," she said quietly. "To memory," Lucas echoed her softly, lifting the malt glass to his lips for a slow, unhurried sip. No trace of sharp, bitter aftertaste lingered on his tongue this time, only balanced layers of wild peat, heather honey, and faint mineral spring sweetness, finished with warm, aged oak. The flavor profile he had spent years refining alongside his father's preserved-tasting logs. The sinking sun draped the entire restored stone mill distillery complex in soft honeyed golden light, the polished copper still silent, luminous witnesses to 10 years of profound personal transformation, how unrelenting hatred, given enough time, could be tempered into something balanced, mellow, and redemptive, just like the decades-long single malt matured within the mill's ancient granite walls. Lucas stood silent beside the open office window for a long stretch of unbroken time, no further words exchanged between himself and Eleanor, his gaze fixed upon the winding spring brook flowing downhill toward distant rivers and the open sea. A quiet metaphor for his own unwritten, unburdened new days stretching endlessly ahead of him. Somewhere far out across the vast, untamed, empty Highland moors, sealed, unopened vintage bottles from the return collection waited patiently to be uncorked. And Lucas Grant stood fully ready to step away from every lingering ghost of the painful past and walk forward into a gentle, hopeful life free of the weight that had clung to his shoulders for an entire decade.